All right, good afternoon, everyone. This is Brandon Gare with the NMQF, our normal Friday webinar. Super excited about this topic because I know a ton of folks have questions about the vaccine and its deployment and the efficacy and all of that. So I have two really good folks on the call. First is our moderator this week is Dr. Donney John. He is, I always call him our de facto chair of the NMQF advisory board. He's been working with us for, I guess, 5 or 6 years now, and we really appreciate all he does and make sure, so if you have actually complaints about NMQF, you should actually go to him instead of me. And then, but if praise come to me, complaints go to Donnie. And then we have Mike Ybarra, who has been working with us for years. He is a MD that works over at PhRMA, and he's gonna take us through and explain a lot of things to us about the vaccine, and then go after level setting, do some Q&A. And so I will go ahead and turn it over to Dr. John and to lead this discussion.
Thank you, Brandon, and it's a pleasure to be here and have a conversation with Dr. Ybarra today. Really talking about vaccine development, answering a lot of questions. You know, a lot has changed within the past few weeks in terms of what vaccines are available, the number of people. You know, we're reaching the milestone of 100 million vaccine doses here in the US, so which is a huge accomplishment. But, you know, globally, the news is changing. So it's going to be a great discussion, and I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Ybarra to really walk us through the current status of vaccine development, and then we'll go into Q&A afterwards.
Great, thank you, Donnie. It's great to be with you. And thanks, Brandon and Keiko and everybody at NMQF who helped organize this. I think I'm going to share my screen to walk through kind of my story of the COVID-19 vaccines based on my work at PhRMA and as well in the emergency department. Can you see the slides? Awesome. Great. Well, thanks again for having me. My name is Michael Ybarra. I'm an emergency physician by training. I grew up in Southern California. I moved to Washington to go to medical school, and I stayed for residency. And if you're in medicine, you know today's a big day in the development of young physicians. It's match day. So every year, graduating medical students go through an interview process. This year, of course, it was very different. It was all virtual. They did virtual interviews, and then you submit your rank list, and then you find out if you match Monday of this week, and then you have to wait 4 very long days until you get to open the envelope virtually. In this case, it's an email because they're not mostly in person. They're doing it virtually. And you find out where you go. It's kind of an amazing milestone. So I just have to throw it out there that match day is today. So medical students all across the country right now at 12 o'clock are opening up their envelopes to figure out where they're going to be physicians in training. So exciting day. I did my training at Georgetown. I did my training at Georgetown where I stayed on the faculty after residency, and I work in the emergency department there. And then about 6 years ago, I was lucky enough to jump at the opportunity to join the team at PhRMA. And PhRMA is the trade association that represents the innovative biopharmaceutical industry, the companies that make new medicines and vaccines, like Pfizer, who you may have heard of, J&J as well, Merck, Sanofi, a number of large biopharmaceutical companies, and really excited to do work with industry, kind of leading our medical affairs engagement, both within the organization, helping us through the COVID-19 crisis, but then also working with external organizations like NMQF. And so it's been a great partnership. I worked last night in the ER. It's definitely better in the DC area than it has been, but COVID's still out there. I did see a patient with COVID-19, was able to provide much more in terms of therapeutics than I was a year ago. March 2020 looked very different. The iPhone is a great tool because I take a lot of pictures, as I'm sure most of you do, and it's really quite amazing to go back to March 2020 and think about the patients I was treating then with COVID-19. We had very little, actually no treatments that had any proven benefit. And last night I was able to take care of patients and use monoclonal antibodies that are kind of these immune systems in a bottle to help them recover faster, use remdesivir, which is an antiviral medicine. And we have more tools in the toolbox. But today is all about vaccines, and I'm happy to answer any questions after I go through a few kind of introductory remarks that hopefully tackle the common questions, but I'm excited for more. This is the SARS-CoV-2 virus, COVID-19. Many of you have seen it on TV. This is a rendering, an artistic rendering based on what it looks like under the microscope. And the thing to really take away from it is the red spike proteins that sit on the outside of the virus. That's what makes it unique from other viruses, why it got the name coronavirus, which is Spanish for crown, because it looks like a crown when you look at it under a microscope. And those red spike proteins are what helps the virus enter your cells and make you sick, but it also makes a really good target for vaccines. And so when people hear vaccine, a lot of people assume that manufacturers have somehow taken the SARS-CoV-2 virus and inactivated it. And that is a technique that's used for some vaccines, but not the vaccines that are currently authorized in the US. The vaccines that are authorized in the US use really exciting technology to really just teach your body to recognize only the spike protein on the outside of the cell. So you're not being exposed to SARS-CoV-2. You're not going to get sick from coronavirus because of the vaccine. You're only training your body to recognize the spike protein on the outside. And there are a number of approaches that PhRMA member companies, as well as other companies, are investigating to develop new vaccines. The mRNA approach is one that you've probably heard of because that was the first two vaccines authorized in the US from Pfizer and Moderna. Both use mRNA, which is really like a blueprint. It's a blueprint that tells your body what the spike protein looks like, how to make it, and how to develop an immune reaction to it. So it's a really exciting technology that is highly, highly effective, as I'm sure you all have heard. And it also has a number of other potential approaches. You know, there's talk of using mRNA type technology to address diseases like cancer, which I think is really, really cool. This is a slide that I pulled from a presentation at a Senate hearing, but I thought it did a nice job of kind of explaining the three leading approaches in the US. And I mentioned the mRNA vaccine approach that is Pfizer and Moderna's, which you take mRNA, which is like a blueprint. It teaches your body to make the protein and recognize it. And so that way, if you're ever exposed to the whole virus, you know how to fight it. Well, the second one in the middle is the one that you may have heard of, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that was authorized, as well as AstraZeneca. They use a similar type of method where they're not showing you the entire virus. They're just showing you kind of instructions for how to make the spike protein. And they use an inactivated virus or a cold virus that can't make you sick, but they use that as a delivery system. And then the third method, which I think you'll hear more of in the next couple of weeks, is a method where that a company called Novavax, not too far from where I'm at. I live in Bethesda, Maryland, just outside of DC. Novavax is headquartered in Rockville, just a few miles up the road, up Rockville Pike from where I live. They have developed a technique where they make the spike protein in moth cells, which is really cool. They make the spike protein and then they purify it and they inject it, so to teach your body again to recognize the spike protein, again, without showing you the entire COVID-19 virus, SARS-CoV-2 virus. So it's really, really cool technology. It's unique approaches. And I think it answers the most common question that I get, which is, can you get coronavirus from the COVID vaccine? Answer is absolutely not. You're not getting the whole virus through these three vaccines. You're just getting instructions, or you're getting the spike protein to learn how to recognize it if you're ever exposed to the whole virus. And typically the process for authorizing a vaccine is very, very long. Usually it takes many years. And another question that I get a lot is, how in the world could you have done this so quickly? And the answer to that is no steps were skipped, but wherever possible, we kind of crunched everything on top of each other. So created efficiencies, worked in parallel instead of strictly in series. And the other thing that I think really helped was, a lot of investment, many, many years of investment in technologies that paid off today. So mRNA vaccines, they didn't just get invented in the last year. The technology that was used to make them has been in research and development at startup companies like Mrna, at BioNTech in Germany. It's been in development for really decades, and it just so happened to meet the moment now. All of these steps were taken, preclinical testing, phase 1 and 2 testing, which is usually a small number of patients to kind of determine the right dose for the vaccine. And then phase 3 testing, which is large clinical trials, 30 to 40,000 people. And Moderna, Pfizer, J&J, they've all done that. The Moderna trial had 30,000 people, Pfizer 40, J&J, I think was somewhere in the middle between 30 and 40,000 people. So these vaccines have been studied before they were authorized. They were reviewed by the FDA. Again, no steps were skipped. So that kind of answers the second most common question, which is how can these be safe if they were approved or authorized so quickly? And hopefully this kind of just gives you a sense that we went through all the steps, in some cases did them in parallel as opposed to in series, so that we were ready. We really had to. We're in this unprecedented pandemic. We had to kind of move as fast as possible. Another really big example is companies manufacturing vaccines well before they knew if they were going to be authorized. So I remember last April, the CEO of Johnson & Johnson went on the Today Show and said, we're starting to manufacture. We need to do it now to anticipation of getting authorized at some point. We need to make that commitment now and that investment now. And same thing for Pfizer, as well as Moderna. And that's why I think although supply has been constrained in the first kind of couple of weeks of the rollout, we're getting to the point now where supply is really ramping up. And the president has announced that starting May 1, they want kind of open season for vaccines. Many states have already gone there. So where are we at right now? The COVID-19 vaccines that have been authorized in December of 2020, Pfizer was authorized, followed by Moderna. Both of those use that mRNA technology that I mentioned, the blueprint that just teaches your body to recognize the spike protein. And then in the last month, Johnson & Johnson's vaccine was authorized, single shot, really cool technology as well. And the benefit of the single shot, can't be overstated, particularly as Donnie knows, working in these mass vaccination sites, trying to reach hard to reach populations. Really important to have different types of vaccines that have kind of unique delivery mechanisms. And I think it's good for us to also just keep our eye out. There are other vaccines that I think we could hear more data on in the coming weeks. Novavax, the company I mentioned just not too far away from where I'm at in Maryland, their vaccine is kind of wrapping up clinical trials. I think we could hear more data from them in the coming weeks. And same for AstraZeneca, Oxford's vaccine. They're completing trials in the US now. So once we get to the point where we have enough supply to meet the demand, in some cases right now, the supply is already more than demand in parts of the country, we really need to work to overcome distrust and hesitancy. And I know that's where we're going to spend some of the Q&A time as well. And it's really hard to do because it's different in every community. So we've heard early on that COVID-19 impacted Latino communities, Black communities really heavily. And then there was high rates of kind of vaccine or I guess lack of vaccine confidence in those communities, but that has started to tick down in part because of the work of NMQF and other leaders in this area, the partnership with NAACP that Brandon was talking about before we started, the work that you all are doing on this line to make sure that you have trusted voices talking to members of communities. But we're also seeing other pockets of vaccine distrust kind of pop up. There's obviously, there's been a long kind of history of vaccine distrust separate from COVID, but we also see other pockets where certain demographics, white males, for example, in some of the studies that have been recently released, have high rates of vaccine hesitancy. So we have to address this from all angles. It's not just one community. And part of that, one very simple thing that I think you can do, if you're on this webinar, I'm guessing you're interested in getting a vaccine at the very least, if not excited to get a vaccine. But I encourage everyone to tell their vaccine story. I think it's a really good way of reaching the communities that you can influence. And I think give yourself a lot of credit because you can influence a lot of people. This is my vaccine story. I told you about the science. I work in industry. I work in healthcare. I've been seeing patients in the ER with COVID-19 for an entire year, if not more now. But I also participated in a clinical trial. And to me, that really kind of, again, like reiterates my interest in the subject, my commitment to wanting to get the pandemic over with as quickly as possible. And also, I can say no steps were skipped. I participated in the steps. I was in the clinical trial. I got a dose in July, I got a dose in September. And then I was told to just kind of live my life, continue to see patients in the ER, don't do anything different and just kind of wait and see. And they studied over the course of several months if people that got placebo had a different amount of COVID as people that got vaccine. And thankfully, I didn't get COVID because once the Moderna Mrna vaccine was authorized, I found out that I actually got placebo. So I was not in the vaccine arm. But shortly thereafter, I was able to get the vaccine. And I can't tell you how great it feels to go to work and have that extra layer of protection with the COVID vaccine. So increasing vaccine confidence has really got to be what we're focused on now. I think a lot of work has gone into making sure we have adequate supply, and we're really on the cusp of that with hundreds of millions of doses rolling out in the coming months. And just today reaching 100 million doses in 58 days of this administration, almost 130 million, I believe, or 120 million in total since the vaccine campaign began. So now I think we've vaccinated people that are excited. There are still more that are excited to get the vaccine, but I think we really have to turn our attention to making sure we're reaching people that are on the fence or are not aware or not excited about it. And that's what I think the hard work of the next 3 months is going to do. And these clips, I think, just kind of, Dr. Gottlieb is somebody that I've followed throughout the pandemic. He's been a great voice with tons of good information. He's been kind of calling this out for the last couple of months. What are we going to do when there's more vaccine than there is demand for it? So I think we all have to work together on addressing that. So I believe that's it for my presentation. I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of go over my vaccine story, the background on the science, and hopefully answer any questions that you might have as well. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Donnie. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ybarra, for that great presentation, all that information. Before we're going to get ready for this presentation, now I wondered, I grew up on SchoolHouse Rock. There was always a class of SchoolHouse Rock taught you everything. I'm like, has anybody made a SchoolHouse Rock video for vaccines? And I was pleasantly surprised that there is actually a SchoolHouse Rock video for vaccines. So I'm going to drop that in the chat so that everybody has access to it. But it is very informative to kind of see the way that we're communicating through a lot of different modalities. And that's one of the biggest things that we really have to focus on. So a question that's really important is, how do we tackle this issue of the infodemic, where there's so much misinformation being given out either on social media, via the news or print media? How can we, or how is PhRMA really looking at a strategy of combating this infodemic problem that we have to tackle?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the best way to fight kind of bad information is with good information. And I think one thing that I've kind of learned throughout this is not to attack anyone that's kind of giving the bad information, and not to attack it as bad information, but instead kind of meet it with good information. You got to meet people where they are. And so I think one of the reasons that I approached this discussion the way that I did, with kind of talking about what the vaccine is, what it does, what it doesn't do, is because there really are kind of a top 3 set of questions that I get over and over and over again. And I started having these conversations early on with my own ER group when in early December, when it looked like the vaccines were going to be authorized and they started talking about rolling them out in the hospital. There was vaccine confidence issues even among physicians in my ER group. Not a lot, but a few kind of questions that really tracked the questions I've got since then, as I've broadened it out, this conversation to other groups. And they really are, can I get sick from it? Can I get COVID? Is it safe given how quickly it was developed? Are there issues related to kind of long-term side effects? And then it kind of spills out from there. So I think if we kind of try to address the top 3 questions with good information, it opens the door to asking questions that might be more kind of disinformation or misinformation, because it is so easy to spread that these days with social media and all of our electronic connectivity points, and that stuff can spread very, very quickly.
So along with the concerns that the general public have of long-term effects of COVID-19 vaccine, one of the things that in the vaccination clinics that we've participated, that my organization has participated, and some surveys that we've done, it's really the concern around pregnancy and sterilization. Mm-hmm. So I know that there are certain companies that are doing clinical trials on pregnant women. And, pregnant women, if they speak with their provider and they make the joint decision to go get vaccinated, they're encouraged to do so. But are pharma companies looking at doing any post-market surveillance on women who are pregnant that got vaccinated, but then also, most importantly, looking at the impact on those children, say up to 3 years after birth? Absolutely.
Yeah, that's absolutely part of the plan. And, one maybe I can take that in a couple of parts. Number one, the original clinical trials did not, purposefully include pregnant women. It was actually an exclusion criteria for the original clinical trials. But over the course of the trials, some women did become pregnant in the clinical trial. So we have data from that first large clinical trials of women that participated. Second, the companies are running specific clinical trials to study, they've enrolled women that are pregnant that are getting the vaccine. And then third, because of the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology's recommendations that basically say you should offer it to your patients, have that conversation with your doctor. Many women, including healthcare professionals, have chosen to get the vaccine, and they're also participating in other post-marketing kind of or post-approval, post-authorization databases that collect a lot of data, like CDC. When you go to get your vaccine, you're able to sign up for that CDC tracking system, where I've done it kind of once a month, basically report in any symptoms I'm feeling. And that's another great way to collect data. So there's tons of data being collected, starting with the original clinical trials that led to the authorization. But the good news is that there are also these clinical trials specifically for pregnant women and other systems that are in place to look at long-term data collection.
So, we have 3 approved vaccines here in the US, the one from Pfizer, Moderna, and from J&J. But one vaccine that's been really big in the news right now is the AstraZeneca vaccine, especially with what's going on in Europe. Can you speak to about what are the concerns that people have in Europe right now, where a lot of countries have stopped giving out the AZ vaccine? And the AZ vaccine is the most globally distributed or available vaccine right now across the world.
Certainly. So that vaccine is undergoing clinical trials in the US now in order to kind of have the data needed to seek a US authorization. But some of the vaccines, there are other vaccines that have been authorized in other parts of the world that aren't yet authorized in the US. And that's one example of them. And there was a lot of, a lot of discussion, concern, information spread about the risk of clotting from one of the vaccines that was used in Europe, the AstraZeneca vaccine. And, there's been public releases, including releases from the EMA, the European Medicines Association, the UK regulatory body, that effectively said they believe these vaccines are safe. They've authorized them and they are encouraging them to continue. But they did take a minute, they took a point to say, let's look at the data quickly and let's determine if there is a higher risk. Now, one of the challenges with all of this is when you're vaccinating millions and millions of people, you think of it like, what happens in a city on any given day? In a clinical trial, what happens among 30,000 people on any given day? And because something happens doesn't mean it's associated with the vaccine, but you always have to look, right? On any given day in a city, there's going to be car accidents, there's going to be heart attacks, there's going to be things that happen, and it's not necessarily always causally related to the vaccine. So the important point is, there are regulators out there whose job it is to look at these things and determine if there is a relationship. And so I think in the US, it'll be looked at through the clinical trial data that's being collected. And then, of course, the European and the UK regulatory agencies, I believe just yesterday, made the determination that they thought that the vaccine rollout could still proceed in Europe.
So because we have 3 choices, do you think there's a specific recommendation for targeted populations to receive one over the other? Is it preferred for, say, high-risk elderly to get one vaccine compared to another?
Yeah, not in the US right now, we're very lucky. We have 3 very effective, highly effective vaccines that do a really good job at preventing the thing that we're really most afraid of from COVID-19, which is severe illness, hospitalization, and death. They all do an excellent job of preventing that. That's kind of the key thing to go back to. The thing that's really scary about COVID-19 is the fact that it leads some people to be hospitalized and too many people to lose their life. So the vaccines all are very, very effective at that. And so the best vaccine that you can get is the one that you're offered as soon as it's offered to you. So now's not the time to be kind of picky. They're all recommended for all individuals based on when your time comes up.
So one of the concerns a lot of people have in terms is vaccine access. There are a lot of people, we talk about hesitancy, that don't want to get it, but there are just as many people that want to receive the vaccine, but there are a lot of barriers in terms of, since we don't have a standardized approach and who's eligible. How can we better communicate and make sure that people that want to get the vaccine are able to actually go and get it, especially people that have complex medical conditions that may not have transportation, like dialysis patients or homebound patients.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think the key is that it's, unfortunately, as with a lot of things, the healthcare system isn't always built with that foundation of kind of, broad equal access. And so to some of us, it's not a huge surprise that in the vaccine rollout, we would run into the same sort of issues that we run into with the healthcare system more broadly. There's not a one size fits all approach to vaccinating everyone in this country. And I'm pleased to see that there are jurisdictions like the ones that I live in, DC, for example, that's kind of making the point and rolling out other ways to get people vaccinated who might have issues. I mean, right now, it's easier to get access if you're really tech savvy, if you're willing to wake up at 3 a.m. and troll a lot of websites to go through, the Department of Health website and the various kind of chain pharmacies. If you're really good at clicking and kind of having multiple tabs open, there's a tech savvy element to it. But I think some jurisdictions, including the ones in our area that I'm familiar with, have recognized that, and they're starting to roll out new approaches like 1-800 numbers, manned call centers that have more staff. The institution that I work now has kind of a referral line within the hospital. So if a patient that I might be worried about, needing to get the vaccine, they can't sign up, and I don't, as an ER doc, don't spend a lot of time trying to get patients signed up. I wish I had time to do that, but we need kind of extra help. So they've set up a referral line. So you can put the referral in. Hospital has kind of developed a team that will reach out to patients to kind of help them. DC is also set up, which I think is great, kind of senior kind of touch points. So there are kind of volunteers to help seniors sign up and get vaccinated. So all of the above approaches to try and kind of get over the barriers that too many people are facing in order to get access to the right folks that need the vaccine kind of now. And then the broad access is right on the horizon.
We have Walgreens and CVS both partnering with Uber and Lyft, respectively, in order to help with that transportation barrier. And I believe in DC, we have MedStar Hospital that's doing mobile vans in terms of vaccinating people within the community. So I think that provides a lot of hope, especially with people that are having challenges in terms of getting into those hard to reach areas. But I do have to give a shout out to the independent pharmacists that are out there. There are, like in West Virginia, for example, they are taking the vaccines on the road, going to people's homes that are in hard to reach rural settings to really make sure that delivery is actually happening. This is a very, team-based effort across the country with all multidisciplinary healthcare professionals and pharmacists really actively engaging in making sure that vaccines are available. So once we have more distribution channels and we have more access points, we should definitely have some better access overall. But one of the things that's interesting is that, we alluded to earlier how there's so many different vaccines around the world that the question now becomes vaccine interchange. For example, one of my neighbors, she came from Brazil, got vaccinated with AstraZeneca in Brazil for the first dose. Now she's wondering, well, I'm going to be in the US for the next 6 months. What do I do about my second dose? So can you speak about vaccine interchange? Is there any information or data out there about what to do for those scenarios where if somebody comes from a country where they got a vaccine that's not yet approved in the US, how should they manage their care going forward here in the US?
Yeah, that's a really tough situation for that one individual. So I would recommend, at this point, there is not vaccine interchange in the US that's recommended. It's really you start on your path, whether that's Pfizer, Moderna, J&J, or any of the ones that are authorized in the future. And that's the path that you really should stay on. That's why we're giving out, or the HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, is giving out these cards that indicate your first dose, the manufacturer, lot number, and you're supposed to follow up within that kind of 21 or 28 day time frame to get your second dose. And it's really important that you stay because we don't have good data on kind of switching over. So that's why it's important too, if you are, if you are getting a vaccine, you really make that plan for the second dose. And I think in the US, we've really made placed a strong emphasis on making sure that if you get the first dose, you get the second one within a reasonable time frame. There's a little bit of wiggle room, but we've tried to stick to the 21 days for Pfizer, 28 days for Moderna, and then J&J is obviously one shot, so kind of one and done.
Great. One of the questions that we have in the Q&A was, could you share more information about the second approach, not using the mRNA, but more so like the J&J, because a lot of issues, concerns people have with the J&J is that, it's not 90% effective like the Pfizer and Moderna was. Or should I get the J&J? Could you speak a little bit more how that technology works in terms of how it's still effective in tackling the coronavirus?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is still very, very effective, and kind of meets all those endpoints that we're hoping for, which is preventing hospitalization, severe illness, and death. And what, this is actually an approach that's being looked at by a couple of different manufacturers. The first one authorized in the US was J&J, but we could see more. It basically, similarly, is all about kind of developing the blueprint for the spike protein. It's not about showing you the broader virus, but it's developing the blueprint for the spike protein and then using kind of a vector or some other vessel to carry the spike protein blueprints into your body. So the mRNA approach is a little bit different because it's mRNA that is the blueprint for the spike protein, but it's kind of held in a shell of lipids or fats. I had a great description for the mRNA vaccines, which is they're kind of like M&Ms, where the mRNA is chocolate and then it's kind of in that candy coating shell, and it needs to be in the shell because otherwise the mRNA would melt. That's why it also is stored at such low temperatures. It's deep freezers that you all have probably heard of, where it needs to be at like negative 90 degrees, somewhere in the 40 to 90 degree range now. I think that guidance has been updated, but it needs to be kept at a very, very low temperature. The adenovirus approach is a little bit different because it uses kind of a vector to carry the material that's a little bit different. In this case, it's an adenovirus or an inactivated cold virus, one that can't make you sick with the cold, but it's using it's using a carrying device to get the instructions to you. It actually can be stored at a different temperature. So the Johnson & Johnson vaccine recommendation is actually closer to normal refrigeration temperatures. So as you're thinking about rolling out vaccine to different parts of the country, ones that maybe don't have those deep freezers, there is certainly benefit. And for a big country like the US, with kind of different access to healthcare for different parts of the country, more rural parts of the country versus more urban, you can see where having multiple vaccines that have different storage requirements is actually really beneficial. You mentioned the mobile clinics. The med students at Georgetown last weekend just did a big event in Southeast DC. They did a mass vaccination clinic with J&J vaccine, and it was really exciting to see. They had a really high success rate, but it just provides a little bit of flexibility, and you're seeing mRNA vaccines being rolled out very, very successfully, but they might be more used in kind of hospitals or in pharmacies where they have more kind of physical infrastructure. So it's a benefit to have different approaches so that we can get people vaccinated as soon as possible.
Thank you for that. So another question is that, we have so many people getting vaccinated right now, as we alluded to earlier in the top of the conversation, that there was about 100 million doses given out by today. And we have other companies that are bringing new vaccines to market. So that means there has to be more clinical trials done. How are companies going to enroll participants in clinical trials when we have a two-track system? We have a number of people getting vaccinated. A lot of people still want to get vaccinated, but then we've always had a vaccine, especially in clinical trials, on underrepresentation of vulnerable communities. Mm-hmm. How do we attract, people to get into clinical trials, but also at the same time build that trust where, why am I going to try something that's not known versus the three options already currently on the market?
Yeah, great question. I'll kind of break that up into a few pieces. Now, thankfully, I believe for the other vaccines that are likely to seek authorization in the first half of this year, I believe their clinical trials are fully enrolled. So that's a good thing. So we're not trying to enroll people and kind of making them have to make a tough decision between, do I just get the vaccine that may be available to me now, or should I participate in a clinical trial? So I think thankfully we kind of avoided that question, and that the trials are fully enrolled. But there are other ways to do the trials that could allow for them to continue if another promising vaccine comes forward. So right now it's placebo and vaccine. So placebo and the investigational vaccine. So I got a shot of placebo, but other people in my trial got Mrna. Placebo just means you got a shot of saline. So I didn't feel anything. I didn't feel arm soreness. I didn't feel any side effects because I just got a shot of saline in my arm when I was in the trial. But you can also do trials. You can design them a little bit differently, and this would take conversation between the sponsor and the FDA. But you could do a trial that has kind of maybe an authorized vaccine with an investigational one that shows promise. So, that actually is I believe what one of the trials did in the UK, they used the tuberculosis vaccine as the control versus I believe it was AstraZeneca's vaccine in the UK as kind of the intervention arm. So you can design trials in different ways. It doesn't always have to be placebo. I'm guessing the companies that maybe are interested in this are likely having conversations with the FDA to determine how they might design a trial, given there is vaccine out there now for a lot in the US.
What about the question regarding getting a booster dose? Some people are in the mindset that we may need to get a COVID vaccine every year, just like a flu shot.
Yeah.
Speak a little bit more about the potential need for booster doses, especially with all the variants that are popping up across the globe.
Definitely. Yeah. So the booster question is a good one. Just remember the virus has only been on this planet, as far as we know, for about 15 months. So there's a lot of questions that we don't know about how long immunity lasts for. There is good data starting to emerge that immunity does last for a period of time, but for a while we didn't know, can you get reinfected within a certain period of time? Is the vaccine going to last, forever, or is it only going to last for a few months? So it's important, and this is part of the study protocols, that companies are looking at whether or not booster shots would be needed at 6 months or at a year. And we just don't know yet. We're gonna have to wait and see what the data shows. The good news is the vaccines are very effective. And once we get them rolled out, getting a booster shot or a flu shot could be seasonal, like the flu shot, which, to me wouldn't be the end of the world. I know it would be a big kind of adjustment for some folks that haven't been thinking along those lines, but there is a possibility that we could need booster shots in the fall, particularly, as you said, where new variants might be popping up in that booster, even if it's a booster of the original kind of native wild type of the coronavirus, even if it's the original vaccine, could just give you the boost enough to combat these variants that are popping up. But the most important thing to do now to worry about is to keep doing what we're doing, meaning masking and social distancing, and then getting the vaccine as soon as you're able to. And that will certainly help us kind of avoid a situation where we have more variants and more concern with another spike.
Perfect. So, one of the big questions is that we've spent a lot of time and energy right now building trust amongst, Americans and just all over the world in terms of vaccine trust. So trust is very hard to come by, especially in vulnerable communities who have been disenfranchised for such a long time. What is PhRMA going to do going forward in terms of continuing to maintaining the trust that they've built that's been going on, but also to build trust going forward? And is there opportunity for more collaborations with HBCUs and other minority serving institutions?
Definitely. No, it's a great question. And maybe I'll broadly speak about PhRMA. Like many organizations, just in the last year, has been really taken by all of the, kind of things that I think many folks on this line were well aware of, but just kind of crystallized how important it is that we have an approach to equity. And so there's a team that is focused significantly on addressing issues related to equity. We have a unique role to play. So our focus is on things like diversity in clinical trials, for example, is one key pillar of that. So I think building trust is going to be really, really important. So part of our work is to share good information about the vaccines, support organizations like NMQF that are also trying to get the word out about vaccines, and then doing what we can do to kind of help our ecosystem meet the needs of diverse patients in the US and around the world through things like diversity in clinical trials. There has been a lot of movement in that space with regard to the COVID clinical trials. It's not perfect by any means, but we did see a great improvement in the number of underrepresented minorities participate in the clinical trials. So whereas maybe before COVID, you would see 3 to 5% of clinical trial participants come from underrepresented minorities. In Pfizer's trial, for example, and in Moderna's, it was closer to 20%, which is really, really important because we know that, again, underrepresented minorities in the US were disproportionately impacted by COVID. So if it's a disease like COVID that impacts Hispanic, Black communities, we need to make sure that the trials kind of appropriately represent the demographics of the disease. And there was some movement. Wasn't perfect, but it was a step in the right direction. We want to kind of capitalize on that and make sure that we're improving on it moving forward.
So one thing is, diversity in terms of participants from clinical trials. But what about having researchers from diverse backgrounds, from especially different ethnic backgrounds, to be part of the design and development of clinical trials going forward? Where is PhRMA in terms of the advocacy for that perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So PhRMA actually released also in the last 6 months we have a kind of principles for conduct of clinical trials, and it's a voluntary kind of code that we work on with our member companies to develop. And it's a book basically, and it's got all sorts of kind of recommendations for how to conduct clinical trials. And one of the things that we did in the last 6 months was add a chapter on diversity in clinical trials, which was kind of first of its kind, and I think kind of sends a signal that, as an organization, kind of leading trade association in this space, we worked with our member companies to make sure that we had principles specific to diversity in clinical trials. And so in the principles, it mentions exactly what you said, which is, we need to make sure that we have investigators that represent diverse, that kind of can connect with and have access to and engage patients from diverse communities. And oftentimes that means working with HBCUs, working with physicians that are in, pockets of the country that have higher rates or higher percentage of underrepresented minorities. And this was very crystal clear to me when I participated in the COVID trial. So, a number of things that I've heard people say, I actually got to experience. There were things that I could overcome because of the situation that I'm in that I was very grateful for. Like, for example, having to drive an hour to the clinical trial site. I had a car. I was able to drive an hour. The trial was at a major medical center that I worked at that medical center in residency. I remember rounding on trauma patients and still navigating a major medical center, even as someone that worked there. It's a maze. It's massive. If you've ever been to one, these things are like, these are huge. Having a job that allowed me flexibility to take 4 hours off multiple times to sit in a clinic and read complicated consent forms. So all of those things are really, really important challenges that I think we recognize in the principles, and then also make recommendations for how to address. Clinical trials are very, very complicated, so it's not something that's going to change overnight, but it's something that we're committed to. And I think the conduct of clinical trials principles, Keiko shared. Happy to have a further discussion on that, but I would encourage folks to take a look at them because I think there's some good kind of next steps in there.
So I'm just looking at the chat and kind of looking at some of the other questions that we have some of our attendees providing. So just give me a quick second. There's a question about monetary compensation for participating in clinical trials. Could you speak a little bit more to that aspect of the development of the COVID-19 vaccine?
I think, that's a good question, and it's a fairly complicated question as well, because there's things that companies can and can't do in that space. So I think it's really a matter of covering kind of typical expenses that a patient might incur as a result of clinical trials. So for example, parking at an academic medical center is it's sometimes the most expensive part of your healthcare visit. So there are kind of expenses that you incur that are to be covered, but there are also limitations. So it's a pretty complicated topic. It's an area that I know a number of organizations are also kind of looking at. So how do professionals that are not, traditionally affiliated with a hospital or academic institution, No problem.
get involved in national research? Because that's always a question of, if we want to train the future scientists, we need to get them involved in the program.
Yeah, no worries. I got that. I've been trying to drink throughout to keep myself from doing the same. I think you pointed out a really good issue, which is we have to kind of nurture these relationships and really tackle them early on, tackle them at every phase, but then also be willing to provide mentorship at every phase too. And I think about this a lot when I think about kind of, residency and mentoring young physicians. The ideal world, we start at the very beginning, but I think we also have to recognize that there are ways that we need to kind of help at every single point. So there's lots of good examples of collaboration. So in DC, for example, one that I'm aware of, MedStar working with Howard to create a consortium. And I think industry is really involved in some of the development of those consortiums, making sure, again, working with HBCUs to get investigators kind of involved in the process and mentored through the process. I did a webinar earlier this week with one of our member companies, and there's also just a lot of kind of tips and tricks for working with new investigators, kind of helping them through the recruitment process, that our companies are doing some really great things to provide that mentorship early on.
So one group that we haven't talked about is the Native American group. what is being done to really engage that group? Because historically, that's a group that has not had enough emphasis put on them, and when it comes to clinical research.
Yeah, well, and they also, I would say, are in the bucket of individuals in this country that have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. And I was really impressed. I read earlier this week that a number of tribes in Oklahoma have actually opened up vaccines to all Oklahoma residents, even though they received an allotment for their tribe. They've actually opened it up more broadly. So we're actually doing some work in that community as well. Some really great work by some of our member companies also to make sure that they are working in the community to set up treatment centers for patients that are impacted by COVID. We didn't really talk much about treatment, but there is a lot of disease happening in the US now, and there are treatments available. Unfortunately, too often people assume you get diagnosed and you need to kind of go home and really just quarantine, but you actually have treatment options available now. So there's been a lot of outreach and work with our member companies to a number of kind of Native American tribes to make sure that we have kind of outreach and resources available to those individuals as well. Again, because they were disproportionately impacted by COVID, like many minority communities, we want to make sure there's access to treatment and then also access to vaccine to be able to address it as quickly as possible.
So I saw recently this week, the Coalition of Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, CEPI, they announced that they're going to have a 5-year, I think like $5 billion or some ridiculous amount of money initiative to really make vaccine development in 100 days or less. Could you speak to a little bit about what that Moonshot program is?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm specifically familiar with that, but I know there are organizations like CEPI, Gavi, COVAX are all working to make sure that we have kind of global access to the vaccine. It's a huge issue because I think we're not, and I think, I would say most of the public health officials within government and outside of government are recognizing that we need to really quickly vaccinate America, but then I also think we have to make sure that we're also addressing the public health threat. It's a global public health threat, and if it pops up in other countries, it's going to pop up here again as well. So I think a lot of work is going on with those organizations to make sure that there is global access to vaccine. Gates Foundation also playing a big role. The vaccine, the main issue related to vaccine access is manufacturing, but that is just ramping up at an absolute extremely rapid pace. And you see that in the collaborations that companies are participating in. So there's been a lot of talk of, oh, well, let's just take the vaccine, instructions or IP, intellectual property, and let's, just make it in a different factory. Well, it doesn't really work that way because the issue is the factory capacity. We need to have the factories to be able to make the vaccine. And so what we've seen is great collaboration between companies that maybe initially thought they were going to be making vaccine, but theirs didn't work, or it didn't work as quickly as they thought. And so now they're lending their manufacturing capacity in order to make more vaccine, which is why you see companies like Pfizer, Moderna, J&J say they're going to have hundreds of millions of more doses available on a much quicker time frame. So I've just been really impressed with the rapid ramp up in manufacturing capacity to make sure we're meeting this demand. Because if you remember a couple of months ago, we thought that we wouldn't have this much vaccine even by July. And every time there's an update, it's that things are moving faster. And that's all very, very positive in terms of access. And we, again, I think, there are a number of organizations like Gavi, CEPI, COVAX, Gates Foundation that are also thinking about the global implications of this as well.
So, recently Congress passed the big relief bill. How is that going to impact in terms of vaccine access, but also the future research involved in terms of making sure that the most in need of care are going to get access to care going forward in the future?
Yeah, certainly. Well, I know, the vaccine development process is, it was multi-year, right? So everybody thinks of it as being the last year, but it was really all about investments that were made over the course of a decade. So mRNA technology, thankfully there were companies out there that were investing in developing it even before we knew if there was going to be a vaccine. J&J developed this AdVac platform, again, over the course of decades. It was studied in other diseases like Ebola, studied in the original SARS, the SARS that happened over a decade ago. MERS is another coronavirus. So we have looked at these platforms in other fields. mRNA, as I mentioned, cancer. is an area that's being looked at. So these investments happened over a long period of time, and they're, I think what we need to think about from a pharma standpoint is what investments are we making today to make sure that we're going to be prepared for the next pandemic. So there's a lot of policies out there to say, pharma's not doing really the R&D and, kind of looking at ways to cut pharma, which I think can be harmful for our preparedness, because there is a lot of R&D that happened over the last 10 years, a lot of investments in these new technologies. And so I think we need to be cognizant of that. The relief bill, as far as I know, not an expert in all components of that very, very massive bill, but I know there was a significant amount of money for, vaccine deployment. So helping community health centers, helping vaccine sites with a lot of issues, logistical issues, money for, vaccine sites, money for states and local governments. So I think that'll certainly help with the vaccine rollout. I could be wrong, but I don't believe that there was specific dollars in there related to vaccine development. I think a lot of that was kind of before this relief bill.
In regards to, there's a lot more investment within the CDC, NIH in terms of helping bring trust back into the science. Could you talk a little bit about the post-market surveillance that'll happen, where there is the CDC has a COVID vaccine tracking tool that you alluded to, that you submitted your responses and you get checked in on a monthly basis. But can you speak a little bit more about what's happening for the post-market surveillance?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's when you go, a lot of these vaccine sites that are doing vaccination, they hand you a sheet of paper that says kind of scan the QR code and then sign up for the CDC, the tracking system. And it's really very simple. I would encourage everyone to do it. It's a good way to contribute to the monitoring. But it kind of gives a lot of information. It gives a lot of data to epidemiologists who then kind of, as I mentioned, it's almost they're looking at these cities, millions, in this case, hundreds of millions of people, to try and determine if there is, if there's any signal, and what's the signal and what's the noise. So it is pretty complicated, because in a population of 140 million, doses that have been given out, on any given day, something is going to happen to people, regardless of if you have an intervention or not. So it's really important to have that data, so epidemiologists can really determine, was this something that otherwise would have happened, or is this related to the vaccine? And the good news is the CDC has been very, I think, transparent. They've published what they call their weekly reports. MMWR, I believe, is the acronym. And they've published data on, for example, the allergic reactions that got a lot of attention early on. They've subsequently published reports, published them in JAMA to kind of reassure the public. It's very, very rare that things like that are happening. So I think they do a nice job of collecting a ton of information. And then I think they're doing also a nice job of sharing it with the public through their reports, and then also submitting it to editor or to publications like JAMA that are read fairly widely, and then subsequently cited by the news, et cetera.
So, we have a few more minutes, but in closing, one of the biggest questions, partnerships are key to success. So with all the attendees on the webinar today, what are the best ways for community organizations, non-traditional partners to get involved, to work with pharma in terms of building that trust and also helping to advance science going forward?
Yeah, awesome. Well, I think I'm glad that is a thought, because I think we're all in this together, certainly. And I think the pandemic has been obviously challenging for everyone. But if there is a bright spot, it's the fact that I think science and collaboration is still, it works when we all work together. And the healthcare system was very, very strained early on. And I think we so far have really managed to keep it together. The hospital has had its moments, certainly, where it was just overwhelming, but again, grateful to be coming out hopefully on the other side. And when I think we recognize that we're in this ecosystem together, that one component is not sufficient, we're all kind of necessary to work together, providers, government, industry, hospitals. It's a collaboration, and it takes all of us. And I think we've seen that with the vaccine rollout. And there's been great examples of collaboration, really, very specific examples of collaboration amongst all four. And you can see it in the vaccine rollout. So I think there's a lot of opportunities. Industry is continuing to do a lot to invest in the technology that's needed to be prepared for the next pandemic. There's a lot of them that we're aware of right now. Antimicrobial resistance or antibiotic superbugs. That's a great example of something that we know is going to be a challenge for us. It's an infectious disease problem. it's one that's really kind of right on the horizon. So I think we can see some of the challenges. Some of the challenges you can't predict. None of us predicted COVID, but where we're able to predict or to see upcoming challenges like AMR, I think it's a good idea to try to address them as quickly as we can.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me and all the attendees about this very important topic. Before I turn it over to Brandon, I just want to give a little teaser. One thing that our organization does, we focus on providing life-saving medicine for the chronically ill living in Northern Virginia. But at the same time, we focus a lot on health literacy and cultural competency. So to that effect, we are creating a lot of content in terms of educating people about the COVID-19 vaccine. So one of the things that we are going to release fairly soon is we are going to create these COVID-19 vaccine snapshots, really meant for healthcare professionals to kind of get a high-level overview. So Keiko, if you can just share your screen for a second. So we really want to focus on highlighting the most key parts that most healthcare practitioners are concerned about: number of participants, efficacy, clinical diversity trials that are, all based on the approved current vaccines in the US. So we will be sharing this with the NMQF, so that way the broader audience has access to it. I've had a very talented team members, within my organization that worked hard to really comb through the science, really help make it easier for everybody to understand. But we will make this available to everybody. So the more people that have access to it, the more people can understand how to communicate some of the key scientific points with different target audiences. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Brandon. Thank you so much for giving me the chance to host today.
Well, let's see. All right, just gotta wait a second to start my video, but thanks for doing this, Donnie. We really appreciate it. Thank you to Dr. Ybarra from PhRMA, just answering all those questions, those lingering questions that I know a lot of us had about around the vaccines. I myself just got lucky enough last Friday to get vaccinated right here at Howard University Medical School. But I am happy that I did, and my parents are vaccinated, so I'm feeling good about it. So final things, and one last thing, as always, we have our National Annual Summit, April 26th and 27th. Dr. John and Mike will both be participants in the summit. And so we look forward to speaking to you soon about that. You can register by looking on our events page at NMQF. Without anything further, just hope everyone has a really good week and stay safe and get vaccinated. Have a good one.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.